Okay, students, we are incredibly blessed to have Dr. Alex Kaur, who is the son of Eva and Mickey Kaur, here with us today, two survivors of the Holocaust, which we've been talking about in class. First off, Alex, I can't thank you enough for being with us and taking the time. So
Well,
thank you
Matt,
so much.
yeah, thank you very much for having me, and really appreciate the work you're putting into this. It's very important to me.
Thank you so much. Well, I just kind of want to start and kind of open the floor for you. Can you just talk to us about your parents, what they experienced? We're coming up on the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And so can you just kind of, give us, some introduction about your family and their experiences?
Sure. So my name is Alex Kaur. My mom was Eva Moses Kaur, and my dad was Mickey Kaur. And unfortunately, both my parents, as of now, have both passed away. But my mom was one of the Mengele twins. There was a Nazi doctor at Auschwitz. He did experiments on twins. He would use one twin as a guinea pig and one twin as a control. If the guinea pig died, then he would kill the control and then do comparative autopsy. So my mom is originally from Hungary, Romania, the Transylvanian Valley, and survived 10, 11 months of being in Mengele's lab at Auschwitz. After the war, eventually made her way to Israel, and then by pure luck, met my father. My dad is from Riga, Latvia, part of the Baltic states, one of the states of the former Soviet Union. My mom and dad did not know each other during the Holocaust. My dad was in labor camps, concentration camps for over 4 years, was liberated by an American GI from Terre Haute, Indiana, ended up coming to live in Terre Haute, finished high school, went to college, became a Purdue graduate, a proud Purdue graduate, went to Israel to visit his brother and met my mom.
And is that how your mom came to Indiana?
So my father was working as a pharmacist, and there was no internet dating back then. And so my father was working as a pharmacist, and his two other brothers, one in Tel Aviv, one in Hartford, Connecticut, both survivors, said, "Mickey, you need to find a wife." And he didn't have much luck here in the United States, so he went to Israel to visit his brother Shlomo. And my mom and my dad were set up on a blind date. My mom was in the midst of getting out of the Israeli army. She was a sergeant major. And so my mom went from Tel Aviv to Terre Haute. So really, my mom went from Transylvania, Tel Aviv to Terre Haute. And I was born in Terre Haute 2 years after they made it to Terre Haute. My sister was born 2 years after me.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the museum that was set up there in Terre Haute, and how did that come about, and what has it done since being created?
Sure. So in the late 80s, 1985, we went to Auschwitz with several other Mengele twins, about 50 of them, my aunt included, my mom's twin. In 1993, June 6, 1993, my aunt died. And quite frankly, in my aunt's memory, my mom wanted to do something that she could do to memorialize and honor her sister. And although Terre Haute is somewhat of an ironic place for a Holocaust museum, very few Jews, no other Holocaust survivors except one besides my dad. And so she thought she'll just open up a storefront museum. And in May of 1995, she opened up the museum, and my dad had just retired as a pharmacist. My mom was still working as a real estate agent. So he started working there, didn't really want to give any lectures. And eventually things grew. He did give a lecture and then another lecture and realized it was good for him, somewhat reluctantly. And the museum initially literally had pictures very nicely with, Scotch tape on the wall. And then gradually things grew, got a person to help my mom. And then unfortunately, November 18th, 2003, a white supremacist or several white supremacists burned down the museum. The museum was able to, my mom was able to find money and grants and scholarships, and a new museum was built. And it's at its original location ever since it reopened in May of 2005. And so the museum is a fully functioning Holocaust museum and education center. We have a complete board of directors. I'm on the board. The major theme and purpose and mission is to educate people, particularly young people, about the Holocaust, about the lessons of the Holocaust, how we here in Indiana can use these lessons to make each and every one of us a better person. And so obviously my mom passed away July 4th, 2019, but we continue, and there are some other opportunities here in Indiana to kind of, for at least for me, to continue my mom's legacy.
I saw in an interview, it was definitely a few years back, your mom said, I have the quote right here. She said, "I will tell our story because the world must know." Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you as you sort of carry on that legacy and you carry that story?
So at the end of the documentary by Ted Green and WFYI, the name of the documentary is Eva A-7063. She looks up to the sky and says, "Mom, I will tell our story." And so now, unfortunately, with my mom gone, I feel that obligation to tell my mom's story and my dad's story. And so why is it important? I think it's so important in this day and age. And I'm not going to in any way get political. I think it's important for kids, young people, even adults, to know what happened 77 years ago. It's not that long ago, and it can happen again. And the point is that we need to all understand how to not so much tolerate each other, we need to respect each other. And my mom was she would emphasize this in her lectures, that you should always respect your fellow classmate, your fellow teacher, your parents, etc. Respect is the number one thing that, in my mom's opinion, is causing a problem in society. And I think if you can learn the valuable lessons of the Holocaust, you can apply them to any walk of life. I mean, so many people came to Candles not so much to learn the history of the Holocaust, because some people do know the history, but they wanted to learn how my mom had overcome such adversity. And there's plenty of kids in middle school, high school struggling. Maybe their home life isn't the best. Maybe they don't have much money. And I think it's so easy for kids and adults to have this crutch. And I think the point of me trying to continue to tell my mom's story, my dad's, is to say, look, they came from a terrible past and they still made good in their life and they still raised 2 kids. And I think even if you're not given everything on a silver spoon, you can overcome adversity. And I think, a lot of people say, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And for me, I don't know if you know, but 30 some years ago, I survived cancer. And I truly believe that my parents surviving the Holocaust made it a little bit easier for me to survive cancer. So I think there's so many valuable lessons. And that's why I think it's so important to tell these stories so that future generations don't repeat the past, but more importantly, we all can live happier lives.
Mm. One of the pieces of your mom's story that I think has struck so many people was the story about how, I believe it was in 1993, she went back to Germany and she met with a former Nazi doctor, and ultimately went back to Auschwitz with him, and then kind of famously penned like a letter of forgiveness. Even in her quote, in her book, she said, "Forgiveness is not so much for the perpetrator, but for the victim." Can you talk to us a little bit about, that letter and this notion of forgiveness in the face of the most heinous crimes imaginable?
Yeah, your recollection is completely accurate, Matt. So in 1993, after my aunt died, my mom was mourning, didn't really know what way to turn. And she was given an opportunity, to meet another Nazi doctor who was cleared of all charges. And her initial reason was not to forgive. The idea to forgive, and a lot of people still to this day blame my mom that she had this preconceived idea that she was going to forgive. That was not her intent at all. She wanted to know what Dr. Munch, Hans Munch, what he knew about the Mengele experiments, what he knew about the experiments, so maybe other twins wouldn't face the same terrible outcome as my aunt. And so she wanted to meet him just to see what he knew and what his knowledge could help other twins. And so as they're meeting each other in Germany at his house, my mom was very, very nervous, very afraid. The last time she saw Nazi doctors, they weren't so nice. And he kept on, she had a back problem. So he kept on getting her pillows. And my mom said, you're not like the other Nazis I remembered. And so over a period of time during the conversation, he remembered, his recollection was that he had to sign the death certificates and that he actually saved 20 some Jewish doctors. That was he had experiments. He made it fictitious experiments. There's a book called The Nazi Doctors. He's referred to as the good Nazi in the book. And so my mom said, Dr. Munch, these stories are so important, for all the Holocaust deniers. Would you want to come back to say at Auschwitz at the 50th anniversary of the liberation that there was a Holocaust, that you were there? And he said, of course I would. So my mom thought, my goodness, I've got a Nazi. And she literally called me, and I forget where I was living. And she told me that she's going to have a Nazi doctor come to the 50th anniversary. I said, Mom, this isn't a good idea. No, you don't understand. You don't understand. And I didn't understand. I was against it, very much against it. And so over several months from the fall of 1993 until January of 95, he kept on looking for a way to thank him, because what he was going to do was document that there was a Holocaust, that he was a Nazi. So she went to the local Hallmark store looking for a holiday card or a greeting card. That didn't seem appropriate. Went to buy champagne. That didn't seem appropriate. So one day she was thinking, well, how can I thank him? And she thought, oh, I'll write him a simple letter of forgiveness. So the original idea was to thank Dr. Munch for doing this nice deed. My mom had no idea in the process of doing the letter, refining it, making edits, how much better she started feeling about herself, that she no longer had this chip on her shoulder. And so January 27th, 1995, my mom, at the ruins of the gas chamber, I was there. You can see it on, on Google or whatever, where she read the statement that she wanted to forgive Dr. Munch, and in her name only. And I think that's very important. And she did go on to forgive, and this is sometimes where she has criticized Nazis that, in general. But in her mind, what she was doing was trying to get this chip off her shoulder. And so she still criticized, and I get it. Even in our own household, my dad wasn't so much for forgiveness until years later. And so, but gradually, I saw this change in my mom, and I had a very happy childhood, but there was at times she had a quick temper, and there was this, feeling that she couldn't relax. And after January 27, 1995, she would smile and laugh, and her whole attitude, over a period of several years gradually changed.
Well, you've touched a little bit on this, but I know as a teacher, one of the challenges we face when we teach the Holocaust is that when you see the images and you talk about the gas chambers and you kind of go through this history, it's so horrific that I think for a lot of students, it's like it's a different world, it's a different planet. And a lot of students, I think, carry with them a sense that this is some horrible thing of the past that you mentioned it earlier, that it couldn't repeat ever, or that it couldn't happen here. There's this sort of this bizarre blind faith that I think a lot of people have because it's hard for them to go there mentally. And I think that's one of my concerns, is to show how genocide didn't just end in the 20th century. It's been ongoing. And also that's sort of a constant simmering threat in any multi-ethnic society. And I wonder, what would you say to students who have a really hard time thinking about genocide as sort of like an active threat to our world today, and more so it's locked in history for them?
Yeah, man, that's a really good question. I've never been asked that. Well, from one perspective, they can, history is, we all learn from history. Now we can learn from the Civil War, we can learn from the, World War I, but this only happened 77 years ago. And I think one idea that I've heard, and this is not that much of a novel idea anymore, but I think sometimes students, high school, middle school, have a hard time identifying the number 6 million or the number 11 million. And so I've seen teachers, there was a teacher 20 some years ago that had kids collect Pop-Top tabs, and they collected 11 million Pop-Top tabs. And I think that's helped the students really conceptualize the sheer number. And I think that may be part of the problem in teaching students nowadays. What is genocide? How can it affect me? What's my role? You have a tough job. All teachers have a tough job in trying to make history relatable to kids nowadays. And that, as you said, in a multi-diverse society, how each child, each kid, regardless of background, can try to, and I think it really goes back to respect, as I said earlier. I think if you respect your classmate, regardless of their hair color, regardless of their skin color, if they have glasses, they don't have glasses, whatever. I think if each child respects the next child, then as a society, there's less chance that these bad things will happen. But the other thing I think is important, my mom was once lecturing, and I wasn't there, but I heard this story. For a bunch of 10, 11-year-old kids around her, she was lecturing, and they said, well, Mrs. Core, I don't understand how you knew what to do. Did people tell you where to go, or how did you know how to survive? And my mom was very smart. She stood up and got in the child's face. He backed away. My mom said, well, why'd you back away? Well, that's what I did. My mom said, that's how I survived. Just instinct. And the child had a way to relate to it, because he had just moved back because she was in his face. And she said, that's how I survived. I just did it instinctually, knee-jerk response. This is what I do. Kind of a gut check, or, your idea is you do this right, this is wrong. And so I think that's the other thing that sometimes children in particular don't understand. They think, oh, well, when you traveled to Auschwitz, well, there was no traveling. They were taken without any sense of where they were going, without their permission. And so in today's society, we're so far away from this concept, luckily, from 77 years ago. But at the same token, I think we're not that far away when you think about some of the terrible things that have happened around the world.
Yeah. Well, we're speaking, just days after a hostage situation in a synagogue, and just a few years after, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. I think, and you mentioned the white supremacists that burned down candles, really just a few years ago. I think one of the things that I challenge students to think about is how these white supremacist organizations that may have had institutional power, throughout the 1930s in Germany, they still exist. And, there's active groups in the state of Indiana that are recruiting, that are even stockpiling weapons. When you think about that type of question of, there's been a rise of hate crimes, not just anti-Semitic hate crimes, but, Asian Americans have been targeted, sort of other groups have, become targets of hate. I think a lot of people, not even students, but people feel really helpless. I know one of the questions, and you've touched on this, but one of the questions I got from my students was just, how do individuals ensure that when we say never again, that it actually is never again? Like, what can any one of us do when it's easy to feel kind of powerless in the face of such enormous events and sort of currents throughout history?
It is. Each student, each of us, everyone can feel powerless. But on the other hand, each person has such a power. My mom would answer that question in many ways. And one of the ways she would talk to kids, look, if you have a little pond and you throw one student throws a pebble in the pond, you have a ripple. If you have two kids that throw a pebble in the pond, you have two ripples. If you have 100 students throw pebbles in a pond, you have 100 waves, 100 ripples to make a wave. So the point is that if each and every child can learn about the past, learn the good, learn the bad, and hopefully as time goes on, they mature and they understand, oh yeah, when I was in 7th grade, 8th grade, I learned about the Holocaust. I learned about the genocide in Rwanda or wherever. The point is, I think if we learn, unfortunately, if we as a nation forget the past, we're so likely to repeat the past. And so I think it's very important for me as a child of 2 Holocaust survivors to try to continue to tell my parents' story, just for this reason, that yes, there are hate groups. Yes, anti-Semitism is growing. All hate crimes are growing, unfortunately. But I think each of us can only do so much. We can try to educate ourselves and then try to educate other people. And then hopefully at some point, these students that you have will go to high school, go to college, want to go into some, public service that will hopefully help society. And they'll look back and say, oh yeah, when I had Matt as my teacher, I learned this and now I do this. So I think it all ties in together to how children learn and how their mind needs to be stimulated so that we can learn the difference between right and wrong. I think it's a mistake to teach any form of history without pointing out bad and good.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful idea to think about how, we get to be the ripples in the pond. And that's a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. So I think
Right.
in some ways it's kind of a call to action. So I think that's really powerful.
Right.
I had one other student question I wanted to get to before we kind of get ready to wrap up. And it's a more personal question for you, but they were wondering just how being a child of Holocaust survivors, like it really has to kind of like impact you, shape the way you see the world. How has, growing up with two survivors impacted you and influenced your worldview?
Obviously growing up in Terre Haute, Indiana to two Holocaust survivors was very unique.
Yeah.
And it has taught me a lot of things. So from a personal level, that was, I'm a 10, 11-year-old kid, and I thought, well, I want a new tennis racket. I want a nice shirt like Mike has a nice shirt. And so I would say, Mom, Dad, how come I only have one shirt like that? And my mom would say, well, when I was your age, I didn't have any shirts. I didn't have any tennis rackets. So it was a very difficult lesson for a 10, 11-year-old kid who, peer pressure is becoming a teenager. It was very, very difficult. And I actually, at some point, became very embarrassed by my parents, particularly in middle school, junior high, and then through early high school. And then things really changed for me when the miniseries on NBC Holocaust was shown. I believe it was 1978. I was a junior, I think, in high school. That changed my perspective totally. And from that point on, I saw, that I needed to encourage my mom to talk and tell her stories. And I needed to help my dad initially. My dad was still hurting so much. He didn't want to talk about the past because it was so painful. So I really grew up a lot at the age of 17, and I realized how childish, I was to be embarrassed by my parents. From a worldview, I've been to Auschwitz over 20 some times. I went back the first time in 1985. 2 years ago, this week, I was at Auschwitz for the 75th anniversary. I'm probably going this coming summer with candles. So I think, on a world scale, like that little kid throwing the pebble in a pond, I don't know that I have that much more power than one pebble. However, I do have a lot of experiences. I do know, from a personal standpoint, what my parents went through. And so I try, we've talked about this, but I try to treat every person. I'm in healthcare. I try to treat every patient with respect. I try, no matter what their demographics, no matter where they are socioeconomically, I think it's important we treat every person with respect. And really, for me, I think that hopefully on a world scale will help. I'll tell you one story. My first job was as a podiatrist was in Southern Indiana. I was 31 years old. I had a patient, and he said, I hear you're a Jew boy. You're going to take all my money. And I said, I still remember his first name. And I said, well, you're actually wrong. And I said, obviously you have a preconceived idea. I said, I'm going to prove you wrong. Well, how are you going to do that? I said, well, for the next 3 visits, I'm not going to charge you anything. And I want you at the end of those 3 visits to tell me that you've changed. And so, I think hopefully I changed him. He was much older than me. His wife was apologetic right away. But to me, that was something that I saw as an adult. I was 30, 31, 32 years old. And that always stuck with me, that I think you have an opportunity when in that situation. You can either get very belligerent and, turn somebody off and only possibly perpetuate that misconception, or you could try to teach somebody how to make a change in their life. And hopefully I did that.
Yeah. And I think it takes courage to confront people like that in the way you did. So that's powerful.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of give you the floor for any final thoughts or messages for students. But I know one thing that I wanted to highlight before we left, there was kind of in just reading and thinking about the Holocaust and teaching the Holocaust, I ran into a quote about your mom during a documentary that I was watching. I found it so powerful. So I just wanted to read that, the quote, and unfortunately, I don't even know who said it. They didn't even say the guy's name, but this guy who's, Eva is more than just a story. Eva is a revelation of what's possible in the human condition. And, if there's something that we could pass on to students, it's just that I don't want to compare things, but our students sort of walk through this landmine field of challenges. They're trying to get through school during the pandemic. They're facing all sorts of pressures and problems, and life is hard. And I think in the face of that, we could use people like your parents as places of like courage and inspiration, to recognize that with all the horrible things that have been done in the world, every step of the way, there's been people who have been fighting back the darkness with like their own light and showing us that there's, wherever humans are, there's a chance, because, we're not just disasters, we're also miracles. And I think that's a lot of what I think about when I see your family story. And so I just want to kind of pass the floor to you for any closing thoughts for students, and then we can kind of wrap up.
Well, so first of all, thanks again for having me. I believe that quote was Elliot Gould, a famous actor who's a family friend. I believe that's who said that. There's no doubt that children, students in this day and age, particularly the last now 2 years, have suffered a lot, have been challenged a lot. It's not the typical high school or middle school experience that they all had hoped for. And I can't put myself in their shoes. And I would think that one thing that they can learn from my parents is that, yes, they're going through something terrible, but once they make through this terrible experience, they have this whole incredible world left to them, incredible experiences, life experiences. And so this won't be forever. We're going to get through this. And yes, it's tough. And yes, learning virtually or having to wear masks is no fun for anybody. But I do think that, I've been asked this question a lot. How would my mom have made it through the pandemic? Because she died about 9 months or so before the pandemic. And, it would not have been easy, but she would have, like your students are doing. You're doing things by the seat of your pants. You're trying to in some way make the best out of a bad situation. And I really think that's what she would have done. She probably would have been a Zoom champion. She would have been on Zoom all the time doing lectures. Yeah. But there's, I think the take-home message is respect each and every one of your classmates, respect your teacher, try to learn the most. You're all under a lot of pressure. I know that. The teachers know that. It's not easy being a 16, 17-year-old. My mom would specifically tell kids in this big, big world, it's not easy growing up. And if you don't have a loving parent, then hopefully you have a loving uncle or aunt. But the point is, try to learn and be smart and do the best you can in school. I would want to take this other opportunity to mention that here in Indianapolis, starting in March, there'll be a EVA exhibit at the Indiana Historical Society. It opens up March 10th. And I'm very excited about it. And in addition to students that you have, and hopefully adults and other interested parties, they can go to Candles Holocaust Museum in Terre Haute. There's a hologram there in Terre Haute where you can actually interact with my mom and other Holocaust survivors. It's an interesting experience. I've done it since my mom passed away. It's still interesting. But now here in Indianapolis, you have another opportunity to learn about the Holocaust through my mom's eyes, learn the lessons of the Holocaust. It'll be very interactive. There'll be a hologram here in Indianapolis, and there'll be a hologram in Terre Haute. And so, again, I want to thank you. I don't want to go too long, and this is an incredible opportunity for me to interact with your kids and maybe we can make this an annual event. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really look forward to definitely continuing the relationship, and hopefully one day, maybe there's time when you can actually come in and speak in auditorium or something like that. So this has been a blessing. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll be in touch. Okay.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yes. Take care, Alex.
Okay. Bye-bye.